Let me ask you some questions that emerge from this conception of understanding the Christian faith. The first one, is knowledge of God essentially objective knowledge? That's underneath everything I've said so far. That our knowledge of God essentially is my cognitive grasp on something out there, on something objective. My role is basically just to accept it. And particularly to accept it on the basis of my own reasoning, right? But then what's the relationship between faith and reason? If Christian life is basically acting on knowledge, what's faith? We live in a philosophical tradition that's actually taught us wrongly to separate faith and reason. And then this can become a very perplexing question. What I want you to see is that the question emerges out of how the game has been set up. The way we think faith relates to reason is not the way Thomas Aquinas thought faith related to reason, let alone the way Augustine or Athanasius or Irenaeus thought faith and reason related. If preaching, teaching, theologizing, etc., if that's really about gleaning the principles, the truths from the raw data of Scripture to construct an articulated, systematic worldview from this kind of messy, disorganized narrative thing called the Bible. If that's the case, then do we really need the Bible? Do you really need the Bible if the point of the Bible is the principles that are within its words? Or are the principles enough? How come you're into daily devotionals and not systematic theology? And then, if Christianity is basically information or a response to information, what about people who don't have the cognitive faculties of an Augustine or a Thomas Aquinas or a John Calvin? Or whatever the, what about people who have barely cognitive faculties at all to understand these things? Are they less Christians? What about people who don't have the education that Western elites have? Jesus didn't go to college. Is that a problem? Part of you is probably saying, no, it's not a problem, except I'm not sure how I can explain why it's not a problem. If conversion becomes my own verdict, my own assent to what the facts demonstrate, do I contribute anything to Christian faith, or do I just render a verdict? What's my voice? What's my culture's voice? Do Americans have any specific insights? Do Peruvians have any specific insights? Or Jews, for that matter, in the first century? Or Romans in the first century? And if we do have contributions to make, why? This model doesn't seem to explain how that can be. What does a judge contribute besides good reasoning, good critical reasoning skills? What are other religious traditions? This is actually going to be a question for each one of these models, but what are other traditions? Here, what they turn into is what? False verdicts. Bad judgment. Many of you, most of you, all of you, know people of other religious traditions, right? Are they just wrong? Are their judgments just poor judgments? Did they render the wrong verdict? Now maybe you think, well, they don't really know the facts, maybe they don't know the case, but what if they do? What are other religious traditions? The answer here is going to be different from the answer in the next two. So here's a question that emerges from this way of thinking. Is Christian knowledge as sound as scientific knowledge? Aren't there more reasons for scientific knowledge? Aren't there better reasons? I mean, we all know we're supposed to say no. But is no really the answer? Isn't scientific knowledge more straightforward, more compelling? The kinds of differences of opinion that you have with people of other religious traditions, do you have those kinds of differences of opinion about physics? When it's treated this way, Christian knowledge kind of sounds kind of shaky, doesn't it? Anybody felt that worry on your own? Where you've thought, wait, why is it so hard to prove God exists when it's not so hard to prove the stuff that gets proven in chemistry lab? At least some of the power of that worry is the power of the model that has shaped us into thinking of the Christian faith as a certain kind of thing. You need to be aware of the power of models in shaping our expectations. Maybe your answer is no. Christian faith is as solid as other kinds of knowledge. It's just as solid as scientific knowledge or historical knowledge. In fact, it is a kind of historical knowledge because it's a knowledge about the past of Jesus, of the God of Israel, of the church, etc. If that's the case, well, do you get to have an opinion about Newton's laws? So, should you get to have an opinion about Christian faith, or should Christian faith be the kind of conclusion that everybody ought to make unless they're too stupid or crazy to see it? And if Christian faith is like that, then how about I fail my students in my classes who aren't Christians because they just don't see it and don't get it? Is that cool? It's not, right? By the way, it's not. But why not? Shouldn't Christian faith work the same way? And a last one that's important. Is that how you learned the Christian faith? Is that how you teach the Christian faith to others? Do you give them apologetics? Parents, is this how you taught the Christian faith to your children? Did you give them books by Lee Strobel and say, let's start with the facts of the case? Or did they acquire their faith in some other way? Does their faith have a different kind of story than a legal case? And if so, why? Let's see what you think of the next model. Limbeck calls this experiential expressivism, but that's pretty technical. Let's call it articulated experience. Christianity comes down to named experience, named personal experience. And here, I just have to show you the graphic of the book that strikes me this way. It's a whole curriculum called Experiencing God, knowing and doing the will of God. And that's Moses on the cover. He's turning aside to look at that burning bush. He's having a spiritual experience. Let's put it that way. In this way of thinking, Christianity is one name for a universal human experience of, well, once I put a name on it, I've committed it to particular language. And there's really no alternative. You have to do that. So we could call it the divine. We could call it God. We could call it absolute dependence. That's what one Protestant theologian called it. His name was Friedrich Schleiermacher. Maybe I'd like to call it the Tao, or Dharma, or something else. But whatever it is, it's what we experience as human beings. And Christianity articulates that experience in a particular way. All right? With our terms and with our life. We express our deep understanding of that fundamental experience, which we think is God, the God of Israel. What makes Christianity special? Well, just the particularity of those words. And what makes it better than others? Schleiermacher is going to say it's superior because it names that experience better, more appropriately. It's a language for that universal experience of X that does the most justice to X. All right? X turning out to be the God of Israel. Or the God of Israel turning out to be our name for X. Those are really interchangeable ways of talking. How do you acquire it? How do you learn it? How do you teach it? How do you live it? Through spiritual encounters, right? By experiencing God. That's how. So it's learned by experience. And it's defended by the priority of experience. And you've probably heard this again and again if you've asked someone to defend their view and they say, I just know. I just know by experience. Hard to argue with that, isn't it? If you want to exploit that, you can start every sentence with, I feel that. I feel that, da-da-da-da-da. And who's going to argue against you? They don't know how it feels to feel that, right? What are some consequences of this picture? Well, evangelism, instead of being acquiring information, it becomes facilitating experiences of X, of God. And teachers aren't experts so much as they're mystics. They're facilitators of God's presence and power. That's what kind of worship leader you end up with. That's what kind of pastor you want. That's what kind of youth leader, what kind of camp counselor you have. You want someone who makes God present, you know? And conversion becomes my yes to an encounter with God that inaugurates a personal relationship, which is really an inward relationship, a mystical relationship. And after I've inaugurated that relationship, my job is to continue in that relationship and deepen it and bring others into it. So I'm going to call them mystical practices take priority here. Practices that promote encounters with X. Maybe those are biblical devotional practices. Instead of study Bibles, you use an application Bible or a devotional Bible. Worship services come to be oriented around encounters and responses, feelings. So instead of the sermon dominating the service, music, right? Prayer. That's why the mood lighting. That's why the amplifiers. That's why the progression of music in the set to take you into a pretty interior place of meeting up with God. You don't go to church to be fed, you go to church to feel. And the sermon is about bringing people to that response, to an altar call. Not to render a verdict, but to experience. All right? So some questions. Is my experience of God determinative for who God is? Is my experience trustworthy and reliable? What about your experience? Should I trust my experience or should I trust your experience if our experiences seem to disagree? How do we arbitrate between opinions? What about people whose experiences are horrible? What about people whose experiences come down to suffering, isolation, pain, loss, nothingness, emptiness? Is that reality then? It sure feels like it, right? And what about people who don't experience God? What does that mean? Mother Teresa lived this fantastically fruitful, faithful life. And then after her death, her diaries were found, and her diaries contain account after account of feeling absence of God. And it rocks people in this camp, because what do I do with that? So is there no God, or is God a bad thing? How would I know? How can I tell? How do we know that such an experience is the experience of God? What if I'm experiencing something else? How would I know? How could I tell? What about other people who have experiences and they come up with different vocabularies, different conclusions, different traditions? And when they name X, they name it a different name. Schleiermacher thinks that Christian vocabulary is better than other vocabularies, but that just means that they're both good. They're just different levels of good. That means in a way that all of them are, to one degree or another, valid. You can see where this is going, right? What you call God, I call something else. And we're all more or less right. I call it God, you call it Dharma. So is there a difference? Does it matter? Dharma is a big Hindu word for the way things are. God is the big Christian word for the way things are. Does it matter that we call it God and they call it Dharma? In a way, it doesn't matter in the same way as it did before. Can it be shown that God and Dharma are the same thing? Can it be shown that we experience the same thing in our own different ways? If I asked you who God was and you gave me an account of God as you know God in your life, how do I know that's the same experience I've had? How do I know that's the same God? Where can we go for some kind of perspective on that isn't just someone else's private inward take on it? And then who are we to make more of it than just a relative vocabulary? Who do we think we are? To say that God is a better word than Dharma.